Hello and welcome to episode 107 of the Ego Chall Podcast. My name is Preston Byers, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host Justin Binkowski. And on today's episode, we're talking more Call of Duty League action, including possibly the return of the defending world champion New York Subliners. Might be talking about the death of the Miami Heretics and the downfall of our Vamos boys. But before we get to any of that, how are you doing, Bink?
Doing all right. Spring training is officially underway in the MLB, so that just means we're that much closer to baseball season, which is obviously the best time of year. But more importantly for our listeners, we just had another week of online matches, and feels like it's going to be a while till we get to a LAN because there's more qualifiers this time around. But yeah, we got to deal with the schedule as it's put in front of us, just like I always say about the teams and playing the teams in front of them. So we're here to talk about the few games we saw this past weekend.
Yep, we have quite a bit of qualifier weeks. We have 5 in this set, but we are now through 2 of them, so we're almost halfway there. Let's just hop right into it because we started off with an interesting matchup with New York and Boston. New York did not look like themselves at the major, of course, and that's been the biggest talking point for them this season. Boston has been obviously kind of a lower tier team so far earlier in the season, but they did make a roster change with ASIM coming in the lineup for Capsule. But this matchup between the Subliners and the Breach definitely did not go in the way of Boston. A 3-0 win for the Subliners, a very dominant win for the team to kind of get back on the horse, so to speak. Of course, they did have a pretty good week last week, but they struggled with Carolina in that one matchup last week, and then Seattle is kind of a different story. We don't really know what to expect of them. So what'd you make of the Subliners 3-0 win to start off week 2 over Boston?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty dominant performance in terms of 3-0. The closest map is the hard point, really, which was 250 to 177. It was a 6-3 in a search and the 3-0 in the control. So pretty strong performance out of New York. And honestly, probably the most noteworthy thing to come out of the series was the clip that was shared either yesterday or earlier this weekend of apparently the CDL ref running some water or doing some dishes mid-map, and ASIM having to tell him to shut the hell up and mute his mic.
Well, who doesn't do dishes during the CDL matches? I mean, that's classic CDL. Just not a lot of quality control, it seems like, going on over there. But that was a great moment. Hopefully we get a few more of those. I don't necessarily need more dishes, but maybe refs just doing different things. We can make a compilation by the end of the year. But yeah, New York wins 3-0. Like I said, with them kind of struggling against Carolina, and Carolina not being considered one of the best teams by any means this year, that matchup last week had me a little concerned for Boston, for the matchup against Boston, because I do think ASIM is an upgrade over Capsule, and that the team in theory should be better. But New York, I think when they're playing at their best, I mean, they might be able to beat Toronto and FaZe on a consistent basis. Obviously, we will get there. A little bit of foreshadowing. Next matchup was, it's always kind of a banger with these two teams, but the Minnesota Rocker versus Optic Texas, two teams that don't really, you wouldn't expect it, because there isn't any kind of like big like heated rivalry, but Accuracy has pulled off some amazing clutches in the past against Optic. It was not meant to be here, although Minnesota did make it a series. They started off winning the first 2 maps, and then they were reverse swept by Optic. Any thoughts on this? Obviously, if you look at the stats, it's kind of like, how did Optic win? This is kind of a reverse Optic, usually where we see their maps and they are all plus KD. They're always jumping off the page statistically, but not in this match. Minnesota had all plus KDs and still lost this series. So any lasting thoughts or memories from this series?
Yeah, I mean, I don't remember exactly how we worded it last time at the end of the episode last week when we were doing predictions, but I'm pretty sure we both were on the same page. Like we were taking Optic, but we've seen the script before of accuracy versus Optic, and we're kind of thinking that it might be possible for an upset to happen here. And I remember distinctly when I was watching these matches. Uh, on Friday thinking when Minnesota went up 2-0, like, oh, well, we're both getting this pick wrong because Minnesota's going to close it out. And then especially towards the end of the control, it was Karachi control and Minnesota were on defense in the overtime. It looked like they were going to be able to close it out with a 3-0 win, and Optic wins a 3v14. Now, it didn't go down to kills, but Optic was able to, essentially kill a wave of Minnesota and then hop on the point in the diner there in Karachi and get the final capture. So it was a 3v14 situation. They didn't, get all 14 kills, but regardless, that was clearly a defining moment in the series because if they don't get that, they lose 3-0. Instead, they win that control, go on, win the next two maps, and complete the reverse sweep. So, pretty impressive performance out of Optic to be resilient like that, able to stay calm when the pressure's on in a match like that. Although it's just an online qualifier, but still important to get those points where you can, important to get those wins. So big win for Optic, and it's definitely one to look back on potentially if they start heating up now. That could be a catalyst because if it, like I said, it went the other way and Minnesota wins 3-0, who knows how Optic responds after that.
Yeah. Two teams that really need wins, need points this season: Miami Heretics and the Las Vegas Legion. Two teams kind of floating in that bottom four that nobody wants to be in. You don't get the champs at the end of the season if you're there. Both of these teams really need to kind of pick it up and gain some momentum. It looked like it was going to be Miami. Obviously, they had the gauntlet last week with Toronto and FaZe. That's a horrible first week schedule, but they started out this series against Vegas on Friday with a pretty dominant, decisive hardpoint win, then a round 11 search and destroy win to go up 2-0 in the series, but they lose invasion control. They get blown out on Rio hardpoint, and they lose invasion search. Reverse swept to drop to 0-3 on the season at that point. Any thoughts on this? The thing that jumped out to me was Rio again, because we talked about it last week that Miami had played, I believe, 3 Rio maps in the first week and lost all 3. They played Rio Hardpoint in map 4. That was by far their worst loss of the series. So 0-4 at this point. So any impression that you got from Miami or Vegas after this match?
Yeah, I mean the big thing, like you were saying, especially after last week, where they make the roster change and they have to play 2 really tough opponents. You're kind of like, okay, that is what it is. Now we have a very beatable team in Vegas put in front of us. Let's see what this Miami team is capable of. And it looked like they were gonna be able to take a 3-0 win potentially, or going up 2-0 regardless is impressive, especially based on what we saw from Miami in the previous week. But Vegas, who seemingly have been reverse swept more than any other team this season almost, they're able to pull one out of their own. Really, Nero was a huge part of that, went massive in that map 331 and 14. Geo, I would have to look at all the maps since he's entered the team, but it was probably his best map in map 4, 32 and 16. And then they close out the reverse sweep with a 6-3 in the search. So, yeah, Nero had a 1.4 KD overall in the series. Geo was a 1.17, attached with a 1.1, and everybody else was negative. The highest on Miami was a 0.99 from medals at 79 and 80. So, still questions around Miami now. I mean, it's tough for us to really gauge what this team is capable of. Can't really even judge the roster move just because they haven't gotten the results. But I guess glass half full look here is they at least took 2 maps. Obviously, you get a 2-0 lead, you want to close things out and secure those CDL points, but that's more maps than they won last week against 2 tougher teams. Obviously, difference in opponent and all that stuff, but yeah, end of the day, shout out Vegas for pulling off a reverse sweep when they've been the one getting reverse swept a lot this season, and back to the drawing board for Miami.
Yeah, I think the LAT, or excuse me, I'm looking at the match after this, but I think Vegas had been reverse swept 3 or 4 times at the time that they made their roster change, bringing in Geo, which, and it wasn't like, they're getting reverse swept by FaZe and Toronto. Like I think they got reverse swept for the first time by Carolina, who hadn't won. So, obviously they were struggling. They look a little bit better, but we also don't really know what Miami is capable of, or what they're not capable of at this point with this new lineup. I'll talk more about Miami when we get to their second match of the weekend. But yeah, definitely an impressive win for Vegas. And a great map 4 by Gio, like you mentioned. Saturday, February 24th, we had 3 matches that day. Vegas, as much praise as we might want to give them, they are not on the level of the Toronto Ultra, obviously. And the Ultra proved that with a 3-1 win to kick off the Saturday's matches. I mean, not a big surprise there whatsoever. Granted, there was a map win for the Legion, which is definitely signs of improvement or something, a moral victory, so to speak. And it was a very dominant search and destroy win. So there is something for that. These maps were very close in general, but in terms of the actual victory, that goes to Toronto. But how impressed were you by Vegas that this was a very winnable series in that they played all of these maps pretty close?
Yeah, I mean it's strange looking at it from a numbers perspective, but this was another series for Vegas where statistically Nero and Geo were playing very well. Scrap obviously had a good statistical series for Toronto, but I mean, if you told me going into this Vegas was going to win a search 6-0 against Toronto, I probably would have laughed in your face. If you also told me that both hard points were going to be 250 to 240-ish in that range, what was it? It was 250, 232 for Rio and 250, 247 in map 4, and the map 4 was definitely a winnable one for for Vegas as well. It was a pretty wild ending there where Toronto clutched up and closed things out. But yeah, a lot of people were obviously expecting Toronto to win this, I would assume. And Vegas kind of showed up and had a definitely stronger performance than I expected, and probably a lot of others expected as well.
Yeah, definitely not expecting, uh, you know, for a team to take a map off of Toronto. It's not like the most surprising thing, but to do it so dominantly, 6-0 is just kind of a ridiculous. It doesn't happen very much regardless, and for it to happen with one of the best team and then one of the worst teams, at least in terms of standings, that does jump off the page a little bit. Next match, we had LAG versus Optic. Not a big surprise in terms of the victor here either. We had Optic winning 3-1. Dashi played very well in this series, at least statistically. But it's interesting that Optic lost the opening hardpoint. It's kind of surprising to see them lose, respawns in general a lot of times. And it was not a very close hard point at that. So any cause for concern, or do you think that's just kind of a, something that happened, not a big deal?
The only thing I can think of is it was definitely something at the time that I was thinking about, like during that match. This is 2 series in a row where, obviously against Minnesota they were down 2-0. This is only 1-0, but different maps too. It was a real hard point for Minnesota, that one map won against Optic, and this is a Karachi. The only thing I can think, if it was the same map, I would probably have a stronger case here, but due to seedings and stuff and how the vetoes work, Optic is probably choosing to be Team B in the veto process and giving their opponent the map 1 pick, and then they get the later picks. Could just be speculating there, but that could be one potential explanation. Definitely something to monitor now for Optic's future matches to see if they continue to have these slow starts or if they start to turn things around in that regard. But yeah, you see that first map, LAG, kind of a blowout in the map one, and you're like, oh boy, here we go again. But Optic turned up after that, took care of business, and had a strong 2-0 week.
Yep. I think Optic fans probably going to be a little annoyed at times about dropping a map that they shouldn't, but ultimately, if you win the series, I think there's really not that much cause for concern. It's not like they are the most dominant hardpoint team in general this season. I mean, that they're winning searches is, I think, a promising sign, no matter the opponent. Last match of Saturday is one of the more interesting ones because it gives you kind of an idea of where these teams are in relation to each other. Because beginning of the season, I think it was pretty obvious that Miami was viewed as the superior team. They were looked at, they were one of the best teams in the stage one qualifiers. But obviously things have changed very drastically since then with their major one performance, and now starting 0-4 in the major two qualifiers with a 3-2 loss to LAT. I'm really not sure what to make of this loss. They did lose the first two maps and then forced a game 5 and then forced a round 11 on terminal search, but still to lose to LAT, who I think we both agree are not a very good team. Maybe this new roster is different, so we might have to take a little more time to look at it. But I'm not confident that LAT is much better than a bottom 4 team. And for Miami to lose this series to them, that's a really, really bad sign. This should have been a week where they went 2-0, or at least 1-1, and to go 0-2 against LAT and to go and Vegas, that's almost unacceptable, and I feel like it almost guarantees that they will be starting in the losers bracket at Major 2, which essentially is a snowball effect because that's not giving you great opportunities to get points and to move up the standings, or in their case to avoid moving down the standings. So any thoughts here? 3-2 win for the Thieves.
Yeah, I mean, first off, shout out to the Thieves winning a hard point. It seemed like something that might not happen all year at an earlier point in the season, but all jokes aside, yeah, they came out and started hot in this series, and then on the flip side of what happened in Miami's previous series against Vegas, looked like they had the potential for a reverse sweep, but LAT clutches up in the Game 5 round 11. So pretty close series map wise outside of a 6-2 in the map 2. It was 250, 215 map 1, 3-2 in the control, which we see a lot of. 250, 223 in the second hardpoint invasion, and then a 6-5 in the Game 5. So outside of that map 2, pretty close all the maps around. And yeah, I just think this is obviously being 0-4 when you've played 4 maps is worst case scenario. The only way it could be worse is if, Miami had gotten swept and didn't pick up 4 map counts. So that could be the saving grace for them for any potential tiebreaker scenarios. But they still basically have to go 3-0 for the rest of these qualifiers, assuming they only play 7 again. Would have to go 3-0, get 3-4 record wise, and then have some tiebreakers advantages due to winning the 4 maps this week despite going 0-2. But yeah, I don't really know what to make of the situation. Like you said, Miami was looking strong in the online matches early on. And again, they had a tough week last week against 2 strong teams. But this week they played 2 teams that are not nearly as strong as those teams they played in the previous week, and they still ended up losing. So we'll have to see if there's any further changes or anything behind the scenes that we've learned about what's going on there. We do know they signed Real as a sub. So is it possible he gets a shot now if they decide to make another change? We'll have to wait and see. But Yeah, I don't really know what the answer is for Miami, and just looking ahead next week, it certainly doesn't get easier for them. So we'll have to see how they respond. But obviously, LAT, they could have been very easily in this conversation. On the other hand, if they had been up 2-0 in this series and then let Miami reverse sweep them, we could be talking um, about how it was a bad loss for LAT. So it was a good thing they were able to close that out. Get a win on the board with the new squad. Ghosty in particular had a strong series, 95 and 83 for a 1.14, which was tied with Lucky for the highest KD, even though Ghosty had a few more kills. But yeah, overall, I think kind of like you said, it's two teams in the lower half of any power rankings right now, but one potentially is creeping up a little bit where Miami is kind of just crashing through the tiers, as you might say. So, still want to see more from both squads, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think with Miami, what's so concerning is that other than that optic win in the last week of the qualifiers, which was a shocker, they have 4 wins other than that this season. First against Carolina, then against Vegas, then against Minnesota when Minnesota was still winless, and then against LAG to close out the qualifiers. And this, having LAT, having Vegas on your schedule, that's kind of the same vibe of, if you're going to lose almost all of the matches to kind of like mid to high tier competition, then you have to beat these bottom feeders, for lack of a better term. The teams that have been stuck at the bottom of the standings, you have to beat those teams. And of course, these were not like blowouts. It's not like they were getting swept, but you can't lose both of these series essentially. And it's pretty much going to seal their fate in terms of the major two brackets. So that's unfortunate for them. As far as Real goes, because you mentioned him, his signing, that felt like, that felt like when an NFL team signs like a veteran quarterback and it's like, oh, he's just a backup. And it's like, yeah, I'm sure. Like when a rookie is struggling and the veteran gets signed off of waivers or something, I'm sure that has no bearing on what's about to happen. And that's what it feels like. It feels like once Real is able to play, unless Miami is like in the middle of like a winning streak, that he's coming into the roster like almost immediately. So that's something that the Heretics are probably preparing for as we speak. But we have absolutely no idea when or even if that's going to happen. But let's move on to Sunday matches. We had 3 matches on Sunday, starting off with Seattle versus Carolina. So Seattle has been probably the most interesting team to watch in these qualifiers. Granted, we haven't been able to see very much of them so far, but of course, with this Illy situation, him not being in the lineup, it's kind of hard to know what this team is going to be and how they're going to look. And the answer so far has been not good. They are now 0-2 for the major 2 qualifiers. They did win a search and destroy, which is a positive sign, something that I've been particularly worried about. But they still lost to Carolina. The respawns were not close, and that is pretty worrying. It makes me think that this team is kind of in the same boat as Miami, that they might be plummeting down power rankings or the standings if they're not able to turn it around like very soon. Granted, they've only played 2 matches where Miami has played 4 in these qualifiers, so there is a bit of a difference there. But do you have the same vibe with Seattle that they could be in quite a bit of trouble?
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing that stood out to me here. Definitely was the search and destroy win. That was kind of a talking point for us for this team without Illy. Um, so that's one positive you can take away. But yeah, the respawns weren't close in this one, and it's not like this was against Toronto, right? Like this is against Carolina, which is one of the newer teams. Even though it's not like the newest team, they still were mid qualifier roster change last time around. So, and to play devil's advocate there too, I feel like I'm always talking about Carolina's searches and how they might be able to turn the corner there with the search knowledge and veterancy they have on that squad, but they dropped one here, so I'm still going to be keeping my eye on Carolina's search. But yeah, definitely a convincing victory out of Carolina, especially in those respawns. And probably my favorite interaction again for this series in particular was a tweet from earlier today where Fellow shared that he got a text from his grandma asking what stair glitching meant. And Fellow told her it's when you lay down on a staircase, they can see you, but you can't see them. It's not allowed, but one of the kids we played yesterday used it and still lost. And Grandma Fellow goes, "Thanks, I had no idea how to take it. Glad it didn't go well for him!" Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. And Arcides responds just simply, "Dude," which makes me think that it was possibly Arcides who was the one stair glitching and may have caught a stray there from Grandma Fellow. So that was a pretty good interaction on the timeline. Shout out head Ego Chall correspondent Tremy for sharing that with me earlier today, and I definitely got a good chuckle out of that one.
Yeah, that's amazing. We need more grandmas in Call of Duty. I just looked it up. Seattle 4-13 this season in search. I don't have the time to break it down by not Seattle, Carolina.
Oh.
got Seattle on the brain. Carolina is 4-13 in search. That's probably like the opposite for Seattle because they're horrible in hardpoint and control. So that's the only way they win matches is through search. But Carolina, I'm not sure what the breakdown is with TJ and now Fellow in the lineup of, how many matches or how many search maps they've won. I'm going to guess not that many because it seems like we're talking about them losing a search map more often than not. But, I think Clayster said it right, that's kind of like the last thing that comes is the search stuff, especially if you're replacing half of your roster from the preseason team. That makes it kind of a difficult a difficult task, even though there is obviously some familiarity with, especially Clayster having just teamed with TJ last year and teaming with Fellow previously. So maybe that'll help. But again, that's kind of a work in progress. And Seattle, if Brezzy is able to kind of fit in with that team, their search is some of the best in the CDL, so that it might not be that big of a deal that they lost to the Surge and Search, but we'll see.
So not counting the major, just in the major 2 qualifiers, Carolina would have went 2-1 last week in search because they won map 2 against New York, then New York reverse swept them. And then in their series against Boston, it was the opposite of this series where they only won the search and lost all 3 hard points or all 3 respawns to Boston. So so we have a series where Carolina wins a search, gets reverse swept, wins a search, loses all the respawns, and then loses the search, wins all the respawns. So who knows what's really going on there, but definitely something to keep an eye on for me for sure.
Yeah, another interesting stat is that Carolina is, like I said, 4-13 in search this season. 3 of the 4 map wins have been on Invasion. They're 3-0 on Invasion, so they're 1-13 on every other map in the pool.
And I know for a fact that one of the Invasion wins would have been in the reverse sweep against Vegas because I'm pretty sure Gwyn had the round 11 ace, and that's what Clay had like the ninja defuse. I'm pretty sure that was the one against Vegas in the first set of qualifiers.
Yeah, so they're 0-2 on High Rise, 3-0 on Invasion, 0-3 on Karachi, 0-3 on Skid Row, which I don't think matters anymore, and then 1-5 on Terminal. So like, it hasn't been good, and if they're able to move any closer to 500, that's a massive improvement. It's the same thing with Seattle. Like if they're able to consistently win 1 respawn, that is a huge deal for them. That can essentially keep them in the middle and avoid kind of sliding down the standings, which is, pretty much the best thing that they can ask for at the moment. Next match, Minnesota versus Boston. This was an interesting matchup because Minnesota, they obviously lost the first series of the week to Optic. Not too big of a surprise that they lost, but Boston is, not Optic, obviously, and they were still not able to win this series. They were up 2-1. They won Invasion Search and Invasion Control, and then lost a very, very tight sub-base hard point, and then got blown out in Search on Karachi to finish this series. Now 0-3 to start the Major 2 qualifiers after they finished fourth at Major 1, where they pretty much rocketed up the standings because of that after starting. I mean, granted, they were I think 0-3, 0-4 to start the Major 1 qualifiers. So do you think that's in the cards for Minnesota now, or is this kind of regressing back to where we thought they might be before Major 1?
I mean, maybe at this point, you can't even really say are they a LAN team or an online team because they had that turnaround last time where they started slow in the qualifiers and then kind of picked it up and definitely played better on LAN. So maybe they are just better on LAN. But no, I'm pretty sure it was 0-3 for them heading into the holiday break, and then they flipped the switch after that. So maybe it's just another slow start. I don't know, but that's definitely something we're gonna have to keep an eye on for Minnesota. Again, kind of, silver lining, more optimistic look. They're not getting blown out, right? Like they had the chance to be Optic and weren't able to close that out. And then again here, they win 2 maps. So when you have an 0-2 week, but you win 4 maps, that's literally the best 0-2 week you can have statistically. So could be worse. That's obviously not what any Rocker fan wants to hear, but yeah, we'll have to see what's next for this squad because they have definitely been a very hard team to get a read of. On the flip side, though, with Boston, they win both hard points in this series, and I know they won them against Carolina because I was just saying how they only lost the search there.
And they got swept by New York.
And they got swept by New York. Okay, so that's what I was trying to find. So yeah, so that would be
4-1.
4-1 in hard point. Who won? Minnesota won the control, so 1-2 in control, and then search. They're 1-1 here, 1-2, 1-3 in search. So
they're a hard point team.
Really, that's yeah, I guess. Definitely, still early days for this squad. It's also fun to point out it's ASIM beating another team that he was formerly a member of. So that never seems to go well for ASIM's teams in particular because then the org always tweets out, hey, you dropped this or whatever, and it's funny. But yeah, I mean, strong win for Boston here that has us questioning where Minnesota really is, and we'll have to see how both of the teams respond heading into next week.
Minnesota will so they play LAT at the very end of next week, in addition to playing Atlanta next week. So, the LAT match is the one that I'm more interested in for them because if they lose that, then it's DEF CON. We're panicking a little bit. But Minnesota, like you were mentioning, they had a chance to beat Optic. They lost 3-2 to Optic. They had a chance to beat Boston, lost 3-2 to Boston. First week of the qualifiers, lost 3-2 to Toronto. So they've lost in Game 5 to the best team, Toronto, to Optic, who's top 3, top 4, and then Boston, who, we'll see. We'll see what they end up being. They're more of an unknown. But still, to go to Game 5 and to lose each of them, you would hope that eventually it'll kind of, even out where you start winning a few of them. A few in a row will definitely help. But to start off the week against Atlanta this coming week, that sucks because there's a good chance they will be starting 0-4 to start these qualifiers. But then, things lighten up toward the end. Their final 3 matches are against some of the worst teams in the league at the current moment. So we'll see what they're kind of made of at that point. Next up, we have Atlanta versus New York, the week finale. Obviously, this is an incredible matchup whenever we can get it. New York, defending world champion. Atlanta, obviously former world champions. Two of the most, if not the most talented rosters in the CDL. And, it's obviously big to see New York just because we're not entirely sure what to make of them after Major 1. But this was a big step in the right direction. They end up winning the series 3-2. Search and Destroy, though, obviously the second, or excuse me, map 2, the first Search and Destroy, that really jumped off the page to win 6-0 against FaZe and Search. That's huge. Any impressions off of this win? Because these two teams are some of the best. This is maybe a future grand finals of a major this season. So any thoughts of New York's 3-2 win over FaZe?
Yeah, I mean that's definitely the thing that jumps out is not only was there a 6-0 for New York in the search, but you beat Atlanta in 2 searches. That's pretty impressive. So now a team like New York is sitting at 4-0 in the Major 2 qualifiers after struggling at Major 1, kind of putting themselves in the best case scenario so far, at least in terms of responding and bouncing back from that lackluster performance in Boston. So yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of the series overall, but it definitely is interesting that New York won 2 searches. That's just something, obviously this is a new roster with Draza this year, but it's just something historically with the trio of Celium, Abizi, and Simp that you could probably count on one hand how many times it's happened. Just a guess, but I can't think of too many times off the top of my head where they lost 2 searches in the series, unless it was maybe like a best of 7 or something in the finals. But regardless, yeah, I think we're gonna have to see how Atlanta is able to. I feel like I'm saying bouncing back a lot, but we'll just have to see what's next for them. And obviously, you kind of highlighted that already. They're playing Minnesota. There's a team that seemingly, despite winning 4 maps, they still went 0-2 this last week. This is not the easiest matchup, but still a match you expect Atlanta to win. So if they lose that one, we might have to start more critically looking at what's going on with Atlanta. But other than that, yeah, just a really strong performance from New York. Really, sitting at 4-0 is nothing to scoff at, and really sets them up nicely for being in the winners bracket at the minimum of Major 2. And when you're 4-0, you kind of have that opportunity to set your sights even higher on potentially locking up the number 1 seed, or definitely like a top 2, top 3 seed. So yeah, definitely exciting time for Subliners fans, especially in comparison to Major 1. And we'll continue to see more out of these squads over the next couple of weeks before we head to LAN action again.
Yeah, so I was just looking up the map stats for both of these teams because the search jumped off the page that they literally 2-0 in search against Atlanta is kind of a big deal. But coming into the series, Atlanta was 13-4 in search, and New York was 12-4 in search. That's just like to dominate in that game mode. It feels like a really big deal, especially since the weakest point for FaZe this season has been hardpoint. I'm trying to look up what their map stats were. So they were 5, 7, 9, 10. So they were 12-9, I think, heading in to this series in hardpoint. So they're, obviously above 500, but that's not great for hardpoint. And for them to win the opening hardpoint of the series and still lose, that feels like a big deal. Of course, if Atlanta wins the rest of their qualifiers, as they are known to do, because they are the most consistent team in CDL history, at least in terms of qualifiers, maybe this match won't seem like anything until the next time they play, and then we can kind of refer back to this and like, oh, this is what the Subliners did last time. But it feels like a big deal that FaZe lost this despite winning that hard point. So, but we'll see, I guess. FaZe still has, I think, like 5 more qualifiers to go in this round. So we'll definitely get quite a bit of time and matches to look back on. The standings now, right now for the Pick'em. So you are 51 and 26. Not the best week for you. Obviously, we both got that FaZe Subliners game wrong. We both picked FaZe in that. And then just trusting Miami was your downfall. 0-2 with them, and then you picked Minnesota over Boston in a really tight series. I picked Miami as well against LAT, and then the FaZe game. So I went 7-2. You went 5-4. I'm 54-23. You're 51-26. Tremor still down at 0-1. Maybe one of these days he'll get a win. But the standings in terms of the CDL now for the full season, and then I think after next week we can start looking at the stage 2 or major 2 qualifier standings, kind of get an idea of where these teams are in relation to each other, because FaZe has only played two matches. Seattle's only played 2 matches, so they still have the bulk of their schedule remaining. But in terms of season standings, I'll try to pull this up real quick on the stream so people can see it. First place, Toronto, no surprise there, at 190 points. FaZe is in second with 155. Optic in third at 130. New York in fourth at 100. So the top 4 that we thought would be the top 4, that is the top 4 right now. Granted, the order is a little weird at the moment because I did not expect the New York Subliners to be in fourth, but there they are. The Minnesota Rocker, despite starting off winless to the major 2 qualifiers, they are still in 5th place with 75 points. Then Seattle, despite also being winless so far in the qualifiers, are in 6th place with 60 points. There's a tie for 7th, Miami and LAG. And then 5 points down is Vegas with 45 points. 5 points down from that, Boston in 10th. 5 points down, Carolina in 11th. And 5 points down, the Los Angeles Thieves with 30 CDL points. So obviously there is that top 4 that's kind of, I think, going to stay that way for quite a while. If not the rest of the season. I wouldn't be surprised if those 4 just kind of maneuver between each other. Anything jump out to you in terms of the standings? Anything that is surprising to you now that we are essentially 2+ months into the CDL season?
No, I mean, like you said, it was kind of like we didn't have a particular order for the top 4, but that's kind of what we had going into the season, and obviously Minnesota and even earlier Miami and Seattle were kind of shaking things up there, but at least for now it's kind of back to what we had in mind there. Obviously Miami and Seattle both stick out in terms of being at 50 and 60 points, which they seemingly were at. I guess Seattle had a better performance at the major, so not quite the same. But both those teams were probably just slightly a little higher in the standings at different points this season, and now more moving back to the middle of the pack or the bottom of that, the champs danger range, we'll say. But that bottom is really close because I mean lately, even LAT at 30 points is only 30 behind Seattle in 6th. So seems like that's something that's always going on. And with more matches this year and in the qualifiers and more points being distributed for placement on LAN, it's possible as we get later into the season, unless the same teams are consistently struggling at the LANs, it's possible that we see more of a separation there, especially towards the bottom. But yeah, other than that, nothing crazy jumping out to me. Maybe Boston down towards the bottom there is a little surprising, but obviously a couple wins in these qualifiers after making some change or a roster change to bring Asim in could be having them headed in the right direction. But yeah, other than that, nothing super unexpected, I would say.
Touching on that point about there being more points distributed on LAN, I think that's really interesting, and I'll have to keep an eye on it as we keep going through this season. But really, the reason that Minnesota is in 5th is because they got 4th place at the LAN. That jumped them over pretty much all of these other teams. Granted, they did finish out the Major 1 qualifier strong, but that 4th place has carried them quite a bit into these standings. And if one of those top 4 teams, like, of course, if Toronto, Atlanta, Optic, and New York, if they're all in the top 4 of the major placings, then this won't be an issue. But if we have another instance of one of those teams getting upset early in the tournament, or maybe they play each other, one of these, two of these teams play each other, and then maybe they play each other again like earlier in the losers bracket, on one of those bottom 8 teams is going to benefit from that. One of them is going to place in the top 4 and really benefit from all of the major placing points that come along with it, which could go a really long way. If Seattle or LAG, if they win like two matches and get to like top 4, top 6, that could be really big, and could play a big role in how these teams end up qualifying for champs or where they're seeded and all that stuff. So I'm really interested in that aspect of it. So let's talk about the matches for the upcoming week. Another kind of short, because there are more weeks to fill, there aren't as many matches per week. So it kind of sucks a little bit, but we only have 2 matches on Friday, March 1st. And then we have 3 on Saturday and 3 on Sunday. Starting with Friday, we got Minnesota versus Atlanta. We mentioned this match already. I'm going to go with FaZe. I'm sure you are as well. But Minnesota definitely has something to prove, something to play for. They do not want to start, I believe, 0-4 to start these qualifiers, which, I mean, maybe it wouldn't guarantee them a loser's bracket spot, but it feels like it might. But I'm assuming that you're going to go with FaZe as well.
I am, but I'm just, kind of like I said earlier, it's definitely one to watch, and if Minnesota is able to pull off an upset here, we might be having a different tone about Atlanta next week. So more attentive, I'll say. I'll be heading into this one, but I will definitely take Atlanta.
Next match, Seattle versus Toronto. Until Seattle can prove that they can win a respawn consistently, I'm not going to pick them, so I'm going to go with the Ultra.
Yeah, I'm going with Toronto as well.
Saturday, March 2nd, 3 matches starting with Vegas versus Boston. A pretty interesting series because we just saw Vegas and Boston have strong weeks. I'll go with Vegas. Maybe they can keep this rolling, but I'm not feeling super confident either way here.
I'm going to go with Boston. I just think, I don't know. I'm excited to see how this shakes out, but I think Boston's been looking strong in the hard points. That Vegas 6-0 in the search against Toronto, though, kind of has me leaning towards them in the search. But if Boston can get it done in 3 in the respawns, maybe that's their path to victory. But yeah, I could easily see this one going to a game 5, but I'll take Boston.
Carolina versus Optic. Gonna go with Optic. The Ravens, they just don't instill a lot of confidence right now. Maybe if this was, Carolina versus Seattle or Carolina versus Miami, I would pick them, but not against Optic.
Yep, I'm going to go with Optic too.
Seattle versus LAG, I just said I wouldn't pick Seattle if they can't win a respawn. I'm going to stick with that, even though LAG also does not inspire a ton of confidence.
I thought for sure you were going to go with Seattle, so that's what I was thinking LAG, because I really don't want to pick either of these teams. But I'll just stick with LAG. Kind of similar mindset to the Boston Minnesota one. Like Seattle might take the search here, but if LAG can take care of business in the respawns, it could just be a 3-1 for the Gorillas.
I just wanted to look up real quick to see what the Gorillas have been doing. How they've been doing in the game modes. I mean, not great across the board. Yeah. So I'm not. There's no there's nothing that jumps out to me, but considering they're not like LAT bad in hardpoint, that gives me a little more confidence that they'll be able to kind of win through the respawns. Yeah, I don't know. I just don't have any confidence in Seattle if Illy's not in the lineup. So I'm gonna go with the Gorillas. Sunday, March 3rd, Miami versus New York. There's absolutely no way that either one of us will be picking the Heretics for this week.
Yeah, I'm going to go with New York very confidently.
So Miami, very likely going to start 0-5 in the qualifiers. That will almost assuredly put them in the losers bracket. I'm just looking ahead. They play Carolina the following week, and then they play Minnesota in their last match. I mean, there's a decent chance that they go 0-7. Granted, Carolina, Minnesota, not world beaters by any means, but Minnesota has been playing everybody tough. Carolina, what they have going for them is that they don't look as bad as Miami do right now. So, pretty decent chance that the Heretics will be 0-7 after having a really good Major 1 qualifier run. Next match, Atlanta versus Toronto. I mean, we both have to go with Toronto, right? Because I just saw FaZe lose, which always worries me. It kind of feels like, like an apocalypse event or something, like acid rain or fires just starting around the world. It feels like something kind of the tide has shifted, and that Toronto is now the big dog that we all have to pick every single week, regardless. And so I'm gonna go with the Ultra pretty much until they prove that I shouldn't pick them.
Yeah, you can probably count on a single hand how many times I've picked against FaZe in the history of the Ego Chall podcast, but we're gonna have to add one in this case here, and I'm gonna go with Toronto.
If FaZe wins, then all right, we could have a talk because maybe I don't know, like it just feels weird to pick against FaZe because, like I said earlier in the show, I mean, they definitely have the best record in CDL history. I think they finished first at the end of every regular season in CDL history. And in qualifiers, they are incredibly, incredibly good. But if they lose this match, granted, they do play Minnesota. Never mind. I was going to say to lose 2 matches in a row, but I'm fairly confident they're going to beat Minnesota. But still, to lose 2 matches in the qualifiers, that's probably not something that happens to FaZe all that often. But yeah, we both have to go with Toronto at this point in time. Last match, Minnesota versus LAT. I mean, I know LAT won. I understand. But they beat Miami, and I'm gonna go with Minnesota. I cannot pick LAT until they beat. If they beat Minnesota, then okay, like I can pick LAT whenever I feel comfortable again. But it's kind of a rule of thumb that I can't just keep picking a team if they have proven that I shouldn't. This is like the LAG rule of like 2021. Like I can't just keep picking you. But so I'm gonna go with Minnesota.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Minnesota too. This is another one similar to Seattle LAG where I really, just don't want to pick either team. But I gotta think if Minnesota's gonna turn things around similar to how they did last set of qualifiers, this is a good one here. Could be a situation though where potentially they struggle against Atlanta, have low morale heading into this one, but I think bottom line, Minnesota has to go 1-1 this week in the worst case scenario. Obviously, they would like to go 2-0. But in a Freaky Friday scenario, it would definitely be something where I just wouldn't know what to think if Minnesota is able to beat Atlanta on Friday and then lose to LAT on Sunday. I just, at that time, at that point, I just throw my hands up and be like, I don't know what's going on anymore.
Yeah.
So. I'm gonna go with Minnesota here. Not super confident in that one, but we'll see what they're able to pull off.
What's interesting is these teams haven't met yet this season. This is their first time playing each other, so maybe that would probably favor LAT. I would imagine. I think anytime like a new team plays,
to watch,
yeah, like I would just imagine like that always favors like the worst team or the newer team in this case. But yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm looking too much into it, but I'm not going to pick LAT, so going to go with Minnesota there. Yeah, I think that about does it. We didn't have a ton of news or any like extracurricular stuff to talk about. It was a solid week of CDL action. We're getting closer. ever so slightly inching toward Major 2. And then I think we are back to the normal schedule for Major 3 qualifiers, which is much better. Like I like just being able to talk about, like 13, 14 matches per week. That seems like a normal thing, and we just haven't had that so far. But we will eventually get there. Make sure to subscribe, like, or follow the podcast feed wherever you're listening or watching on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube. We're on all of them. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to give a like. Make sure to subscribe and all of that kind of stuff. Follow us on Twitter at jbink with 2Ks, at Pres Byers. And the podcast Twitter is at Ego Chall Podcast. Next show will be sometime next week, of course. One of these days we will figure out a consistent day that we'll do our podcast on. But for right now, we will just kind of go live when we go live and upload the podcast when we upload the podcast. And that is just how it's going to be for a little bit. But we really do appreciate you all for listening and watching. It's always incredible to see people like leave a comment on the YouTube videos, or I had I told Bink like whatever a month or two ago that someone DM'd me saying how much they liked the episodes, which is amazing. Definitely not something that you kind of expect at any point. But again, thank you guys for listening and watching. It's been a great season so far, and hopefully we'll be talking about the major. I love the major previews. I love major recaps the most. They feel like the most cohesive. But we'll eventually be there again, and I'm looking forward to it. So that does it for me. Bink, take it away.
Yeah, I think you summed it up pretty nicely. So thank you guys as always for all the support. Kind of like he said, you'll hear from us when you hear from us, and that's when we'll be going live. So thanks for sticking with us if you're longtime fans, and if you're new or returning or anything in between, you got any constructive criticism or any positive feedback and negative feedback, let us know. Always looking for ways we can improve the show and deliver anything you guys are looking for. So thank you guys as always, and remember to send the chall.